The dog found the hillside before she did. He kept returning to the same slope behind the barn, digging at frozen grass while the rest of the yard lay quiet under the first hard frost of the season. She almost called him off it 3 times that morning. There was a banknote to think about, and a house with one less voice in it than it used to have, and a dog scratching at a worthless hill was not a problem she had time for. But she kept watching him anyway. By November, that same hillside would be covered in curved steel, the kind stripped from a military building nobody wanted anymore. By December, half the county would be calling her foolish for it, some to her face, most behind her back. And by the night the worst storm of the winter finally came through, the same people who had laughed would be standing at her door in the dark, asking to come inside. None of that had happened yet. That morning, there was only a girl standing at the edge of a slope everyone else had already given up on, and a dog who seemed to know something about that ground that she did not. She would spend the next several months finding out what it was. What she chose to build on that hillside made almost no sense to anyone who saw it. It was not shaped like a cabin. It was not built from anything a farm was supposed to have lying around. And the reason it worked had less to do with the steel itself than with something the hill had been doing, quietly, every winter, long before she ever thought to ask it a question. If you are watching this from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where in the comments. Stories like this one survive because people still take the time to remember them. And if frontier stories like hers matter to you, subscribing helps keep them alive. Her name was Edith Voss, and by the 3rd week of October, she had stopped setting a second plate at supper. It was not grief that made her stop, not exactly. It was arithmetic. Her father had been gone 11 months, taken by a fever that came on fast and left just as fast. And in that time she had learned to count things the way he never had to. Flour by the cup instead of the sack, coal by the shovel instead of the bin. Days left before the note at the bank came due, which was somewhere near 5 months now, though she tried not to look at the number too often. The house still smelled like him in places. In the leather of his boots by the door, in the pipe tobacco worked into the arm of his chair. She had not moved either one, not out of sentiment, she told herself, but because there was no time to deal with what to do with them, and because some part of her still expected to hear his boots on the porch some evening, stamping off snow that had not started falling yet. What she had left was land. 90 acres of it, most of it flat and workable, already half-planted in winter wheat that would either save her or fail her depending on a season she could not control. And then there was the hill. Every farm in the county seemed to have one piece of ground nobody wanted, and hers was the rise behind the barn, maybe 40 feet at its highest point. Too rocky for a plow and too steep for cattle to graze without twisting an ankle. Her father used to call it the wasted acre, said it with a kind of fondness, the way a man speaks about a debt he has decided not to worry over. He never built on it. Nobody in the family ever had. That morning, the first hard frost had come in overnight, the kind that turned the grass white and stiff and made the water trough crack a thin skin of ice by sunrise. Edith stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands and did the thing she had trained herself not to do, which was think too far ahead. If the wheat failed, there would be no money for coal. If there was no money for coal, there would be no way to heat more than one room of the house through a plains winter, and she was not entirely sure she could afford to heat even that. She had heard what happened to families who ran short in a bad year. Some moved in with relatives, if they had any close enough. Some simply left, boarding up windows and walking away from land their families had worked for 2 generations. She was 18 years old, and she did not intend to be one of the families who left. Outside, past the frost-stiffened grass, the dog was already at it again, digging at the base of the hill in the same spot he always chose, as though the ground there owed him something. Edith set down her coffee, and reached for her coat. She did not know yet what she was looking for. She only knew that everywhere else on the farm had already told her what it could give her, and the hill had not said anything at all. The dog's name was Scout, and he had never once dug at random. Edith had learned that much about him over 4 years, the way she had learned which hens laid early and which cow kicked if you sat on the wrong side. Scout dug where rabbits denned, where a fox had passed in the night, where something under the frost line was warmer or looser than the ground around it. So when he kept returning to the same patch on the north face of the hill, day after day, she started paying closer attention to what he might be finding. The spot was maybe a third of the way up the slope, tucked where the rise curved slightly inward, like a shoulder turned against the wind. She noticed it first because the frost there was thinner than everywhere else on the hill, melted back a little earlier in the morning sun. She noticed it a second time because the wind, which cut hard and steady across the flat parts of the farm, seemed to lose some of its force in that particular fold of ground. She walked the whole hill that week, morning and evening, the way she imagined her father might have walked a field before deciding where to set a fence line. What she found surprised her. The hill was not one uniform slope, the way it looked from the kitchen window. It had a north face that stayed shadowed and cold nearly all day, and a shoulder on the northeast side that seemed to catch the weak autumn sun for a few hours longer than anywhere else nearby. Water from the last hard rain had cut a shallow channel down the west side and left the east side comparatively dry. None of this had ever mattered to anyone, because nobody had ever tried to live on that hill. It was rock and grass, and a place for the dog to dig, useful for nothing a farmer needed. But Edith found herself thinking about it less like a farmer, and more like someone looking for a place to keep something safe. Not crops, not cattle, something that needed to hold its own warmth through a season that could last 5 months or more. She had heard her father say once that a house built into a hillside stayed warmer than one built out in the open, something about the ground itself holding heat the walls could borrow from. She had never seen such a house, not out here, though she vaguely remembered a peddler mentioning dugout homes further west, places where families had lived half underground for lack of lumber. She had dismissed it at the time as a hard luck story from a harder place. Standing on the shoulder of the hill, with the wind noticeably softer against her face than it had been 30 feet below, she was no longer sure it was a hard luck story. It might simply be an answer nobody around here had needed to ask for yet. She did not have a plan. She had a dog who kept digging in one place, a fold in the land that broke the wind, and a banknote with a due date she could no longer avoid thinking about. It was not much to build a winter on, but for the first time in weeks, it was something. Walter Pruitt had ranched the section next to the Voss place for over 30 years, and he did not come by to be unkind. He came by, as he told Edith plainly over coffee she had not offered, but he had accepted anyway, because he had known her father, and because a girl alone on 90 acres with a note coming due was the kind of situation a decent neighbor did not ignore. He had an offer to make, a fair one by his own accounting. He would buy the hill acreage outright, cash on the table before the week was out, enough to cover a good portion of what she owed the bank. He said the ground had never grown a thing worth harvesting, and that her father had known it, and that he himself had known it before her father did. When Edith mentioned, carefully, that she had been thinking of building something on the north shoulder of the hill instead of selling it, Walter set his cup down slower than he needed to. He was not a foolish man, and his objections were not foolish either. He had seen the wind come off that hill in a bad blow, he said, seen it strip shingles off a barn roof 2 farms over. He had watched water come down that slope fast enough after a spring thaw to carve a gully a man could break his leg in. The rock under that topsoil was uneven, he told her, likely to shift if anyone dug a foundation into it without knowing exactly where the seams ran. And even if a person built something that held, what good was a shelter halfway up a hill nobody could reach easily in deep snow. He told her plainly that he was not saying any of this to frighten her, only that somebody ought to say it before she spent money she could not spare. Edith did not have an answer for all of it. Not yet. She had noticed the softened wind on the northeast shoulder, but she had not yet measured what a real winter storm might do to that same spot. She had seen the dry channel on the east side, but she had not walked it after a spring thaw the way Walter had, more than once, watching water take a farmhand's fence post downstream. His caution was not the caution of a man who wanted to see her fail. It was the caution of a man who had buried enough hopeful plans under enough late-season snow to know how often they came to nothing. She thanked him for the coffee and for the offer, and told him she needed a few more days to think it over. What she did not tell him was that she had already begun watching the hill in a way he had not, morning and evening, noting exactly where the frost thinned first and where the wind lost its edge. She did not think Walter was wrong about the risks. She only suspected he had never looked at that hill the way a person looks at a place they might actually need to survive. He left with his hat in his hand, and a look on his face that told her he expected to be proven right before the winter was sort through. Edith stood on the porch and watched him go, and then turned back toward the hill, where Scout was already digging in his usual spot, as if nothing about the conversation had mattered to him at all. The advertisement was 3 lines long, tucked into the back pages of the county paper between a notice for a threshing machine and an announcement for a church social. Government surplus, it read. Building materials, hardware, and steel from a decommissioned army installation sold as is, buyer to haul. The location was a rail siding roughly 20 miles east, where a temporary base built during the war had stood empty for 2 years and was finally being cleared off the government's books. Edith had heard about places like it from a farmhand who passed through that fall, a young man who had spent time near one of the larger bases before coming home. He described buildings shaped like nothing a farm ever needed. Long, half-round structures made of corrugated steel, curved from floor to roof in a single continuous arch, thrown up fast during the war to house soldiers and equipment, and then abandoned just as fast once the war ended. Quonset huts, he called them, and said whole yards of the steel panels were being sold off for pennies on the dollar because nobody in a farming county had any obvious use for curved military housing. Edith had a use in mind, though she was not yet certain it was a good one. What she was picturing was not a hut standing free in a field. It was steel curved against the shoulder of the hill itself, following the same natural fold Scout had been digging into for weeks, the arch of the panel matching the arch the land already made. If a Quonset roof could shed wind and rain out in the open, she reasoned, it might do the same job set into a slope that was already breaking the wind before the steel ever had to. She rode out to the scrapyard on a cold, clear morning with what money she could spare folded into an envelope in her coat pocket, and found row after row of curved steel panels stacked like fallen ribs, along with framing timber, bolts, and doors salvaged from barracks that no longer existed. The man running the sale looked at her for a long moment when she asked about buying enough panels to cover a hillside shelter, and did not bother hiding his doubt. He told her that most folks buying that steel were putting up equipment sheds on flat ground, and that he had never once had anyone ask about a hill before. She bought the panels anyway, along with bolts and a roll of tar paper, and paid a farmhand with a wagon to help haul the load back over 2 trips. By the time word got around town about what she had spent her money on, army scrap steel instead of lumber, a hillside instead of flat ground, more than one person in the county had already decided she had made a foolish decision. Edith heard about it secondhand, the way most people hear the things said about them, and did not argue with anyone who said it to her face, mostly because no one did. She simply began hauling steel up the north shoulder of the hill, one panel at a time, toward a shape in her mind that nobody else in the county had yet seen. Otis Merrick ran the general store on the main road through town, and he had known Edith since she was tall enough to reach the candy counter. He did not laugh at her, not directly, though he heard plenty of laughing from other customers once word spread about the steel panels stacked against her hillside. What he did instead was worse, in a way. He pulled her aside one Saturday while she was buying nails and spoke to her the way a kind uncle might speak to a niece he was worried about. He told her that a girl alone did not need to prove anything to anyone, that there was no shame in selling the hill acreage to Walter Pruitt and taking the money, that plenty of respectable families had done harder things than accept help when help was offered honestly. He reminded her, gently, that curved steel from an army barracks was built for soldiers who moved on within a season, not for a person meaning to live through a plains winter, and however many winters came after that. He was not trying to embarrass her. He seemed, if anything, a little sorry for her, and that was harder to sit with than any joke would have been. Edith listened to all of it without arguing, because arguing with kindness rarely changed anyone's mind, and because some part of what he said was not entirely wrong. She did not know, not for certain, whether the steel would hold through a real storm. She only knew that she had watched the hill long enough to trust it more than she trusted an offer that would leave her with cash and no land at all. She thanked Otis for his concern, paid for her nails, and rode home past 3 other wagons whose drivers slowed down just slightly to get a better look at the steel taking shape against the hillside. Nobody waved. A few nodded. The kind of nod a person gives when they expect to be saying, "I told you so" before the season is out. By the time she reached the farm, the framing was mostly set into the slope, timber anchored where the ground allowed it. The first curved panels bolted into place along the northeast shoulder, exactly where the wind had shown her, weeks earlier, that it lost its force. It did not look like anything else in the county. It looked, from a distance, like something that had washed up rather than something built on purpose. That evening, standing at the edge of the unfinished shelter with the sun going down orange behind the flat land to the west, Edith found herself thinking less about Otis and Walter and more about the coming weeks. The wheat crop still had to come in. The banknote still had a date on it. And the hillside, half covered now in stolen shape and government steel, had not yet been tested by anything harder than an ordinary autumn wind. The rain came 3 days later, harder and longer than anything the season had brought so far, and it found the one place Edith had not thought to check. She had built the shelter's entrance on the east side, reasoning that the prevailing wind came hardest from the northwest, and the entrance would sit in relative calm. What she had not accounted for was where the rain, once it started running downhill in earnest, would choose to go. The narrow channel Walter had warned her about, the one she had noted weeks earlier on the west slope, was not the only path water could take. A second, smaller channel had been hiding under matted grass near the entrance itself, invisible until enough water came down at once to reveal it. By the second hour of the storm, that hidden channel was carrying a steady run of water directly against the base of the entrance frame, and the packed earth she had used to seal the gap between steel and hillside had begun to soften and give way. She discovered it only because Scout would not stop barking at the doorway, agitated in a way she had not seen from him before. When she pushed the door open against the wind, water was already pooling ankle-deep just inside the threshold, and a section of the earthen seal along the lower right panel had washed out completely, leaving a gap she could fit 2 fingers into. There was no fixing it that night. The rain was too hard, the light too poor, and she had no material dry enough to pack the breach properly. She did the only thing available to her, dragging what sandbags of loose soil she could fill in the dark to slow the water's path, and then sat awake most of the night, listening to it, wondering whether the whole structure had been a mistake, built on confidence rather than good sense. By morning, the rain had passed, and the damage was visible in daylight for the first time. The gap had widened slightly overnight, and a section of packed dirt behind one panel had slumped several inches, though the steel itself had not buckled or shifted from its frame. It was not the disaster it might have been, but it was proof that something in her plan had been wrong, and Walter's warning about water finding its own way down that slope no longer felt like an old rancher's caution. It felt like something she should have measured more carefully before she ever drove the first bolt. She stood at the breach for a long while that morning, coffee gone cold again in her hands, and made herself look honestly at what the water had shown her, rather than at what she had hoped would be true. The failure had not ruined the shelter. It had told her something the hill had known all along, something she had missed because she had been watching the wind so closely that she had not watched the water with the same attention. Edith spent the better part of a week doing nothing that looked like building. She walked the hillside instead, morning and evening, in dry weather and in a lighter rain that followed a few days later, tracing by hand where water actually moved once it left the higher ground above the shelter. What she found corrected an assumption she had made, without realizing she had made it. She had assumed the hill shed water the way a roof does, evenly, in a single direction. It did not. The slope carried two distinct paths of runoff, the larger one on the west side that Walter had already described to her, and a second, quieter one nearer the entrance that only appeared once enough rain had fallen to saturate the ground above it. The second path was the one that had found her. She began digging a shallow diversion trench above the entrance, angled to catch that hidden runoff before it ever reached the doorway, and carry it instead toward the larger west channel, where the ground had already proven it could handle the volume. It was simple work, nothing more complicated than a ditch a few inches deep and lined with flat stones gathered from elsewhere on the property, but it required understanding exactly where the water wanted to go, rather than fighting it directly at the door. She also repacked the earthen seal around the entrance frame differently, mixing in clay she hauled up from a low spot near the creek bed, tamping it firm in thin layers rather than one thick mass, the way she remembered her father packing the base of a fence post, so it would not heave with frost. The clay did not need to look neat. It needed to close every small gap tightly enough that wind could not turn a narrow crack into something worse once the temperature dropped and the ground began to move with frost. By the end of that week, the entrance sat behind its own small diversion, and the seal around the steel frame held firm even after a second, lighter rain tested it. Edith did not celebrate the fix. She understood by then that the hillside had many more lessons like this one still waiting. Lessons the ground had been demonstrating for years before she ever thought to ask it a question, and that her job was simply to keep noticing them before winter forced the issue on its own terms. Walter rode past on the county road one afternoon while she was setting the last of the stones into the diversion trench, and though he did not stop, he slowed his horse just long enough to take in what she was doing. He said nothing, but he did not look away quickly either, and Edith found that harder to read than an outright argument would have been. With the water problem corrected, Edith turned her attention to something that mattered just as much and had received almost none of her thought until now, which was how she intended to heat the inside of the shelter once she was actually living in it. She had installed a small cast-iron stove near the back wall, its pipe running up through a section of steel roofing she had cut and fitted as carefully as she knew how, sealed around the opening with more of the same packed clay that had solved her entrance problem. The first evening she lit a fire in it to test the arrangement. The stove drew well enough at first, flames steady, smoke rising properly through the pipe and out above the hillside. Within 20 minutes, that changed. Smoke began drifting back into the room instead of climbing the pipe, thin at first, then thick enough to sting her eyes and set Scout whining near the doorway. She opened the door to clear the air, which helped briefly, But the moment she closed it again, the smoke began collecting near the ceiling just the same. She sat with the problem for 2 full evenings before she understood what was happening. The shelter, built low and snug into the hillside precisely because that snugness held warmth so well, had almost no natural way for air to move through it. The stove was pulling smoke up the pipe well enough on its own, but with the door shut, there was nowhere for fresh air to enter and replace what the fire was consuming, and the pressure inside the small space was pushing some of that smoke back down instead of letting it rise freely. The fix, once she understood the actual problem, was smaller than she expected. She cut a narrow vent near the floor on the opposite side of the shelter from the stove, fitted with a simple hinged flap she could open or close by hand, allowing cold air to enter low while the heated, smoke-laden air continued rising and exiting through the stovepipe. It was not a complicated piece of engineering. It was, in truth, closer to common sense once she had watched the smoke closely enough to understand what it was actually doing rather than assuming the stove itself was somehow at fault. The next fire she lit drew clean within minutes, and stayed that way even with the door shut fast against a stiff evening wind. It was a small correction, nothing like the entrance breach that had cost her sleep and dirt and worry, but it taught her something she would need before the season was finished, which was that a shelter built to hold heat also had to be built to let bad air leave, and that the two needs did not always announce themselves at the same time. The first real test came in early December, a storm that dropped nearly a foot of snow over 2 days and pushed the wind hard enough to rattle the loose boards on the barn. Edith moved into the hillside shelter 3 nights before the snow arrived, bringing what she needed most: a cot, blankets, a week of food, oil for the lantern, and enough coal to keep the small stove fed through whatever came. Scout came with her, restless the first night in the unfamiliar space, settling only once the fire had been going long enough to warm the stone and packed earth around them both. The storm itself confirmed most of what she had hoped. The entrance held dry behind its diversion trench. The vent near the floor kept the stove drawing clean even with the door shut against the wind, and the curved steel roof, buried in snow within hours, seemed to carry the weight without complaint, the same way the frontman at the scrapyard had once claimed it would out in the open. By the second morning, the interior of the shelter had settled into a steady warmth that required only small feedings of the stove to maintain, a difference from the drafty farmhouse she had grown up in that she had not expected to feel so plainly. But the wind that storm came mostly from the northwest, the direction she had built the shelter to face, and late on the second night, it shifted briefly due north, catching the western edge of the roofline at an angle she had not fully accounted for. She heard it before she saw anything wrong, a thin whistling along one seam where 2 steel panels met near the western corner, a seam she had sealed with tar paper during the original construction, but had not reinforced as heavily as the others, having run short of material near the end of that first push. By lantern light, she found a narrow gap where wind had begun working the seam looser, cold air leaking through in a thread she could feel against her hand from 3 feet away. It was not dangerous, not yet, not in a storm this size. But it told her plainly that the western seam was the weakest point in the whole structure, and that a storm coming from a different direction than she had planned for would find it eventually. She did not have more tar paper on hand to fix it properly, not until her next trip to town, and the storm was already breaking by the following afternoon. She noted the seam, promised herself she would address it before anything worse arrived, and let the matter sit for the time being, the way a person sets aside a small worry when larger, more immediate tasks are waiting. The wheat needed checking after the snow. The cattle needed feed hauled. There would be time, she told herself, before the winter asked anything harder of that one narrow seam. By late January, the county had stopped talking about Edith Voss, and started talking about the winter itself, which had settled in with a stubbornness nobody remembered from recent years. Walter Pruitt lost 11 head of cattle to a cold snap that dropped well below zero for the better part of a week, animals caught too far from shelter when the temperature fell faster than anyone expected. 2 farms south of town ran short on firewood entirely, forced to burn fence posts, and, in one case, part of a collapsed hog pen just to keep a single room warm through the worst nights. The Kellerman family, newer to the county and still finishing their own house, moved their 3 children into the barn loft for warmth after a chimney fire damaged part of their main structure, patching the gap with canvas and hoping it would hold until spring. Coal grew harder to find and more expensive when it could be found at all. The rail line slowed by drifts in places further north. Edith made her supply trip into town in the last week of January, buying tar paper along with what coal and food she could afford, and heard from Otis Merrick, in a tone considerably different from their conversation months earlier, that folks around the county had started asking about her shelter without quite admitting that was what they were doing. He did not say it unkindly. He said it the way a man reports weather he expects to matter soon. She fixed the western seam that week, working in short stretches during the coldest hours because the tar paper handled better slightly warmed, reinforcing it more heavily than the rest of the roofline given what the December storm had shown her. It held clean through 2 smaller storms that followed. No whistling, no cold thread of air finding its way through. But the radio in town, and the newspaper 2 days after that, both carried warning of a larger system building across the northern plains, a storm expected to be worse than anything the county had seen that winter, arriving within the week. Ranchers began moving what stock they could into whatever shelter existed. Families began counting coal and firewood the way Edith had been counting it since October, doing arithmetic they had hoped not to need. Edith spent 2 days reinforcing what she could, packing fresh clay into a few smaller seams she had noticed weakening under repeated freeze and thaw, and hauling in enough coal and food to last well past a single storm, unsure how long the roads might stay impassable once the snow began falling in earnest. She did not know yet that the storm approaching would test her shelter in a way no earlier weather had, not simply by its size, but by the direction the wind would eventually choose to come from once it arrived. The storm reached the county on a Thursday evening, and by midnight it had become something the oldest ranchers in the area would still be describing years later. The wind came first from the northwest, exactly as Edith's shelter had been built to face, and for the first several hours it held steady in that direction, the curved roof shedding snow the way it had all winter, the entrance dry behind its trench, the stove drawing clean. She sat with Scout near the fire, listening to the wind climb in strength outside, and allowed herself to believe the worst of it might pass the same way earlier storms had. Near 2 a.m, the wind shifted. It swung around from the northwest to nearly due north, the same shift that had found the western seam back in December, except harder now, sustained instead of brief, driven by a system large enough to bend the weather across the whole region rather than testing it for a single restless hour. Edith heard the change before she felt it, a difference in the sound the steel made overhead, and she was on her feet checking the reinforced seam within minutes, running her palm along the join the way she had learned to, searching for any thread of cold air working its way through. This time, the reinforced seal held. What she had fixed in January did not fail. It was in that same hour, with the wind still climbing, that she heard something else entirely, a sound underneath the storm rather than part of it, faint knocking against the outer door. She opened it to find Walter Pruitt standing in snow nearly to his knees, the Kellerman family behind him, with their 3 children wrapped in every blanket they owned, having lost the last of their canvas patch to the wind an hour earlier, and found their barn loft no longer safe to hold heat. Walter had been checking on stranded neighbors along the county road when the Kellermans flagged him down. And with his own homestead too far to reach safely in the worsening wind, he had done the only thing that made sense, brought them toward the one shelter on that stretch of road he knew had already survived one hard test that winter. Edith stood in the doorway for only a moment, weighing a shelter built and tested for one person and a dog, against 6 more bodies crowding into a space she wasn't certain could hold that much breath, that much heat, that much need, through a storm still building outside. Then she stepped back and held the door. The storm broke sometime before dawn, the wind falling away almost as suddenly as it had risen, leaving behind a stillness that felt, to everyone crowded inside that hillside shelter, almost as strange as the noise had been. Edith woke to find the stove still burning low, the reinforced western seam holding dry, and 8 bodies instead of 1, sharing warmth that had, by some margin she could not have calculated in advance, proven enough. The youngest Kellerman child, who had been coughing badly when they arrived, slept through the last hours of the storm without waking, curled against her mother near the stove. Walter sat near the entrance for most of the night, saying little, watching the door the way a man watches something he is no longer certain he understands. When morning light reached the hillside, the county beyond it told a harder story. 2 barns had lost their roofs entirely. A family 3 miles east had lost most of a small flock of sheep caught too far from any shelter when the wind shifted. The Kellermans' barn loft, which they had been depending on only hours earlier, had partially collapsed under snow load sometime in the night, a fact that reached Edith later that week, and that nobody in the shelter needed explained to them twice. Walter left before noon, walking the half-mile back to check his own stock, and said little on his way out beyond a quiet acknowledgement that he had been wrong about more of it than he expected to admit. He did not make a speech out of it. He simply thanked her, plainly, the way one neighbor thanks another for something that mattered, and went back out into the cold. Word of that night moved through the county faster than any single conversation could have carried it. By the following week, 2 other families had asked Edith, carefully and without much pride left in the asking, whether she would help them think through similar ground on their own properties, hillsides and slopes they had always considered as useless as her own once had been. She did not charge them for the advice. She simply walked their land the way she had walked hers, looking for the fold in the ground the wind already favored, the channel water already preferred, the shoulder that broke a storm before it ever reached a door. The shelter never made her wealthy, and her name never appeared in any county record beyond a line or 2 about winter losses that year, hers notably absent from the list. What she kept, long after the steel had weathered to a duller gray, and the shelter had become simply another building on the property rather than a subject for gossip, was something harder to put a price on. She had learned to read a piece of ground the way her father had once read weather, and that winter, when 6 extra lives came knocking in the dark, that reading was worth more than the 90 flat acres she had spent all autumn worrying over. The hill had never been wasted ground. It had simply been waiting for someone to ask it the right question. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.